All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Ronan O'Malley. I'm from the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, and thank you all very much for coming. Again, thanks to all of our members and all the new faces out there. It's great to have you all as well. So I want to say welcome back and hope you all had a great Thanksgiving. And just a little note, we'll be going a little bit longer than normal since this is a panel discussion, and also to allow all of them time to speak and also time for more of your questions. We'll be going until about 8:15 or maybe a little bit past that. And before I start, I'd like to extend a special thank you to Julian Cardenas Garcia, who's not just our moderator tonight, but he very kindly helped put this great panel together and did a lot of work on the backside of this program. So thank you very much, Julian. And I'll just read all of their bios. They're all a bit shortened. You can check out their bios online or elsewhere. They have all incredible, wonderful bios. I just have to make them a little bit shorter so you can have more time for them and less time for me. I'll let you guess, but 3 of them are Venezuelan and 1 is Cuban. I'll let you guess who's who. And I'll just introduce them in alphabetical order. First, it's Javier Corrales. He's a professor of political science at Amherst College, who's also kindly spoken to the council before. He's the author of Dragon in the Tropics, Venezuela and the Legacy of Hugo Chavez, and also the book U.S.-Venezuela Relations Since the 1990s, Coping with Mid-Level Security Threats. His work appears in many publications, including Foreign Policy, Political Science Quarterly, and Latin American Politics. Corrales was a Fulbright scholar in Venezuela. He has taught at the Institute of Higher Studies in Administration, IESA in Caracas. Also, he's taught at Georgetown University and the University of the Andes in Bogota. Corrales has been a consultant for the World Bank, the UN, the Center for Global Development, and Freedom House, and he obtained his PhD from Harvard University. Next, we have Francisco Monaldi. He just recently moved to Houston, so welcome. I believe coming down from Boston and Harvard. We're delighted to have him. Francisco Monaldi is the Latin American Fellow in Latin American Energy Policy at the Baker Institute and adjunct professor of political economy of oil at Rice University. He's an associate in the geopolitics of energy at Harvard University's Kennedy School, and Monaldi is also the founding director of the Center for Energy and the Environment at IESA in Venezuela. He's consulted with the World Bank, the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, CAF, Development Bank of Latin America, and PDVSA. He is also on the board of Mercantil, which is Venezuela's leading financial group. Monaldi holds his PhD from Stanford University. And next on our panel is Juan Cristobal Negal. He's a native of Venezuela, an economist and a journalist whose work appears regularly in Foreign Policy's website, America's Quarterly, Pro Da Vinci, and El Mercurio. He is also a contributing editor of the online journal Caracas Chronicles, which I highly recommend all of you checking out if you want some great on-the-ground information on what's going on in Venezuela. And I know some of you might be listening right now. We are live streaming this program, so hello to any of you followers of Juan and the Caracas Chronicles, and he's also the co-author of the book Blogging the Revolution. Nagel divides his time between Venezuela and Chile, where he is a professor of economics at the Universidad de los Andes. He is currently a PhD candidate in economics at the University of Michigan. And lastly, but definitely, no, it's just the way it ends up, but our moderator, Julian Cardenas Garcia, once again is kindly talking to us again. He spoke to us before about Venezuela earlier in the year. He served as a career diplomat at the Venezuelan Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and currently is an adjunct professor at the University of Houston Law Center, where he teaches transnational petroleum law in Latin America. Garcia has been retained as an expert on Venezuelan law and international arbitrations regarding both upstream and downstream petroleum sectors. So I'll just let you know if any of you guys have great oil questions out there. There we have 2 real experts on Venezuelan oil issues, so feel free to ask any of those questions. And he received his Master of Laws from the Sorbonne University in Paris and an LLM from the University of Houston Law Center. Please join me in welcoming this wonderful panel.
Well, thank you very much for all of you for coming to this event. I would like to thank the World Affairs Council of Houston for putting all this together, for bringing here from Chile Juan and Javier traveling also from Washington. 3 months ago, we started with the idea to organize an event very close to these elections, the parliamentary elections in Venezuela, and better time couldn't be possible. We are only 5 days before this election, that is very relevant and important for the Venezuelan people given the economic crisis that is living, but also we believe for the international community in the Americas and the South American region. So the idea of the program is we will go through a dialogue with the panelists that we have today, talking about these relevant questions on the current scenario in Venezuela, the political scenarios or results for this election, then to go through the economic scenarios for 2016, following for the consequences for foreign policy of the countries in the region and foreign policy in Venezuela. So to start the discussion, I will ask to our panelists about their ideas on why this election is turning so important for the Venezuelan people, but also the international community is putting the eye on what is happening in this election, which seems to be the first time in the last 16 years that the opposition have some advantage in the polls compared to the candidates supported by the government. So I think we will start with this question. If you want to make some remarks of this importance and relevance of the election, maybe we'll start with Francisco. I will go all of you.
Sure. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And as was mentioned by Ronan, I'm a newly Houstonian, so I'm glad to be here. So I think this is a very crucial election. I mean, we always say every election in Venezuela that it's very relevant because it's a very polarized country in which democracy is in very difficult situation. And of course, elections are one of the few opportunities, that the opposition has to try to change, the situation that we are living. And in particular, we have a very serious economic crisis on top of the continued sort of polarization and social and economic and political tensions that we have had. In the last couple of years, we have had a massive decline in GDP. I mean, this year the projection is a 10% decline. We have, inflation is projected to go to 200%, the highest inflation in the world. Zimbabwe used to be ahead of us, but they got it right, and now we are champions. And so we have last year a recession, this year a huge recession. So. And of course, this situation started before the decline in the price of oil last year. But of course, the decline in the price of oil, Venezuela is 96% dependent on oil exports. So this has been a tremendous, difficult situation for the country. So the elections are the sort of the first sort of opening to see if this massive crisis that has translated into a decline in the popularity of the president can translate into political change. And so we are electing the whole National Assembly. It's a unicameral legislature, and this could be the beginning of either a political transition or generate a further crisis if this does not translate into some degree of change, both in terms of the politics but also in terms of economic policy.
Javier?
To follow up, let me say why they're high stakes and then why they might not be so dramatic in the end. In Venezuela, you have an example of a trend that political scientists have identified since the 2000s, which is democracies backsliding into more and more authoritarian rule. They preserve some aspects of democracy, and in Venezuela, this has been the electoral system, but everything about them is incredibly autocratic. And this has been the process in Venezuela. During this process, the ruling party has been able to slowly capture every political institution in the country. This could very well be the first time since Chavez came to power where the opposition manages to capture an important political institution. And this is a big deal. because we don't know how the government is going to react if in fact it loses. It's not used to that and doesn't like the opposition and doesn't like to lose. So there is that uncertainty. On the other hand, it's only a parliamentary election. Democracies survive with presidents who do not control the Congress. It may not be that big a deal. The revolution might continue, so it could be huge, but it might end up not bringing about that much political change depending on how things evolve.
Well, thank you and good evening. I just want to add to two things that I, as an observer of the events that are happening, would like to highlight about this campaign. If there's anything that has defined the Bolivarian Revolution there are several things that have defined it, but one of the characteristics has been bravado. You know, the Bolivarian Revolution has been all about inevitable change and about establishing a new social order in the country. And for the first time, we see the government campaigning in fear. They are afraid of many things. They have instilled fear in the voters about what the opposition will do if they win, so they've campaigned based on fear. They are so afraid to talk about people's actual problems that all they talk about is about a person who died 3 years ago, Hugo Chavez. That has been their main leitmotif for the campaign. They have not offered any solutions for people's real problems, which have a lot to do with the economy. And finally, they're also afraid of losing power. I mean, the government consistently talks about what is going to happen if they lose the National Assembly. It is an ongoing debate within the revolution, within the governing clique, about the actual possibility of them losing. And this is very interesting for those of us who have been following this, this political process for the last 16 years, because it's the first time we really see them cowed into a corner, basically. And on the other side, we've seen an opposition that has been emboldened and that has probably not made the mistakes that one would expect from the opposition given their track record. They have managed somehow to take missteps or, if you will, stumbles in the road, and they have transferred them and transformed them into opportunities. Let me give you just an example. After the opposition selected their slate of candidates for the National Assembly, for the legislature, the Electoral Council, which is controlled by the government, said, oh no, half of them have to be women. And that was a perfect occasion for chaos to ensue, because political infighting would have been. But what they did was they went back to the drawing board and they selected a good slate of female candidates that they didn't have before, so they raised their quota. And this has brought a freshness to the campaign that we hadn't seen before. So we have a whole new host of female candidates that have taken the opportunity and given the campaign a new tone. And so I think that part of the story of this campaign has to do with that, with things that we haven't seen before in Venezuela.
Okay, next question. I think we will go, we passed from the importance and the relevance of this election to what is happening now in Venezuela. What has been happening in the last 2 months, maybe is happening this week in Venezuela, because from a letter sent from the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, a letter that sent the Secretary General of the OAS to the Director of the National Electoral Council in Venezuela. He highlighted in 18 pages all the irregularities they saw in the electoral system. We see that this is an election, according to the polls, that there are some opportunity for the opposition to have a majority. However, the electoral campaign has shown that it's unbalanced in terms of the power and control of the petrostate and the opposition competing against all this power. There have been changes in the electoral circuits. There have been problems that the one that highlighted concerning the equality in the participation of women and women in the men and women in the candidates. So how are your perspective concerning these unbalanced circumstances for the groups competing, and maybe the scenarios that we will have on Monday after the election? One, maybe the opposition having for the first time a majority in the parliament, or maybe a slightly majority in the size of the government, maybe the opposition winning but with some electoral unrest in the country. We have these uncertainties concerning the scenario. So I would like to hear your opinions.
Sure. So I want to make a case. I mean, the playing field is totally uneven, and there are so many reasons to think that this will not be a fair election. However, the popularity of President Maduro because of the economic crisis, the base of the support of the Chavismo was consumption, was the oil boom translated into big expenditures and significant consumption. If you see the correlation between the popularity of Hugo Chavez and the growth in consumption, it's very high. It's almost 90%. And now, of course, they are not being able to deliver, and the popularity of Maduro went down to about 20%. By the way, it has increased in the last 2 weeks about 11%, and according to the latest data analysis poll, from about 22% to about 33%, which is something that we have to take into consideration. However, still, this is a situation in which the government has a very tough time winning the elections. So the numbers, I will not bother you with the details, but average the 5 most important pollsters in Venezuela, you get about 57 to 31 margin in favor of the opposition, very significant lead. That analysis, which is the most recent poll, is 59 to 30, which is a reduction of 6 points in the margin from 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago, but it's still a very significant margin. That doesn't. The electoral system in Venezuela is a mixed system. Part of it is a proportional representation system, and part of it is it's not a single-member district, but it's a majoritarian system in which the one who gets the most votes in a particular district wins. So the problem is that rural districts are tremendously overrepresented, and in rural districts is where the Chavismo is still stronger. In all the urban major cities in Venezuela, the Chavismo is losing by significant margins. So still, all the simulations that I have seen and the district level polling that has been done tends to show that the opposition will win, not only in votes, that I think that's for sure granted, but also in terms of the number of deputies. And I think it will be a significant victory, even though the margin has been reduced in the last few days. All the things that the Chavismo had done before, like gerrymandering, that changing, the districts, and a variety of other strategies that they have used, are actually not going to work this time, because the margin is so big that the majoritarian system that used to be good for them, because it overrepresented the majority, is now going to turn against them. So my guess is that the opposition will get between 100 and 112 or even 15 deputies of 167. And the relevant issue here is that could mean that the opposition get not only a majority of seats, but also a supermajority. And those are relevant. First, the 60% supermajority, because that could impeach, the vice president and ministers, and could avoid enabling laws that allow the president to rule by decree. And then a supermajority of 66%, which is less likely. I would say it's maybe unlikely at this point, but I think it's still possible, that will allow for convoking a constitutional assembly and for major changes, including a recall referendum and things like that. So I think it's a very important to follow the details about how big is the win of the opposition. But I think it will, Juan mentioned, this is a government that has always argued that this is a revolution supported massively by the people, and to be defeated by a very significant margin will be a major change in the political landscape of Venezuela.
Javier, do you see certain scenarios about electoral unrest for Monday, Sunday?
Francisco is very optimistic. And I am too, but I just want to say that it's very important to bear in mind something that Francisco did mention, which is the electoral system is designed not necessarily to reflect the voting. We know that Chavismo is very unpopular in densely populated areas, but we don't know for certain what's going to happen in rural areas, and rural areas have a lot of representation in Congress. So one scenario could be a very small margin of victory for the opposition rather than a large margin of victory. And one problem with that scenario is that the opposition is going to feel that there was fraud. Even with a small victory, there's going to be a wing of the opposition that is going to say, we don't believe the results. And once you get a significant portion of the opposition mistrusting or the results, you have a recipe for some kind of electoral unrest. I don't know if you guys remember, we used to call them the color revolutions of the 2000s. These were a number of electoral crises that took place in many former Soviet republics and expanded into the Middle East and then became the Arab Spring. In about 14 electoral crises, in about 14 of these regime-type crises, the trigger was disagreements about the elections, either presidential or national assembly. The opposition doesn't win the results, doesn't believe the results, and this could unleash a very turbulent period, a sort of like a color revolution in Venezuela with a small margin of victory. So that's a scenario I worry about, that the government is going to announce a result in which the opposition doesn't win as big and the opposition is just not going to take it.
Well, I'm optimistic as well, I think. And I do think the opposition is going to win, and they're going to win by a substantial margin. The question then becomes, well, what happens with the government after that? And I think we're tempted to think that that's going to mark a turning point or the end or like a definitive change towards regime change in Venezuela. I think that is excessively optimistic, to tell you the truth. Venezuela is obviously, like many Latin American countries, is not a system where power is shifted towards the parliament very easily. It is a presidential system. Maduro still controls the military. He still controls the courts very heavily. He still has the power of the purse strings. And the scenario that we're probably headed to is one where the opposition may control the legislature, but by virtue of legally taking away some of their powers or simply ignoring what they say or putting roadblocks in terms of court orders saying that what their decisions are invalid, I think that there's turbulence ahead. I don't think that the government is going to retreat or that it's going to acknowledge defeat in any way. I think they're playing the long game, and what they're thinking is, I want to continue in power because oil prices will go up, and when they go up, we'll continue having the same party we were having 3, 4, 5 years ago. So we're headed towards a conflict of constitutional powers, basically, in Venezuela. And how that resolves itself, I don't know, because it's a very unusual situation for our country and for Latin America as a whole, I think.
Okay, so after discussing these scenarios, I think next concern is the economic scenario for Venezuela for 2016. Can this election cause a change in economic policy for the country? When we had the first discussion on Venezuela this year, I had the honor to be one of the speakers in January for the World Affairs Council of Houston. And I remember I used as title of my presentation, "Waiting for Godot in Venezuela," because everybody was waiting with the expectation if in 2015 the government will approve the economic measures to try to avoid the crisis the people of Venezuela and the country is going through. So I think my next question to all panelists will be, what are your scenarios for 2016? And do you see that the government will continue in an absence of economic policy? We know that there are companies working in a standby with Venezuela, waiting to see in different sectors if there's a change, they can go again to the country, they can continue to invest, but the situation we see is in a standby while inflation is going up, devaluation is affecting the national currency. So I would like to hear, we have two economists in the panel.
Sure. Let me start briefly with the macro situation and then go to the oil sector, which is relevant for this town. In terms of the macro situation, Venezuela had a deficit of 17.5% of GDP when the price of oil was at its peak, at its average peak. I mean, no OPEC country had a deficit at the time. Now it has, about 21% of GDP. And so the situation, and that deficit in 2012 was due because President Chavez wanted to win the election, and he basically, spent like crazy. And so there had to be an adjustment, but they didn't do it because President Chavez died and President Maduro was unwilling to take the political cost, particularly after winning the election by a couple of points, of doing a major devaluation. this was before the collapse in the price of oil. Imagine, all these imbalances were before the decline. Then the collapse in the price of oil happens, which has been, as you know, in this town, we know how big and rapid it has been. And Venezuela, being so dependent on oil, needed a massive adjustment. And there were particularly two policy options that were obvious. One, a major devaluation, because a devaluation in a country in which the government owns the currency, the foreign currency, improves their fiscal situation, and of course, also it solves the issue of balance of payment. And the other issue was increasing the price of gasoline, that is basically free in Venezuela. To give you an idea, you can fill your tank for less than a cent of a dollar in the black market exchange rate. The next country to give the gasoline cheaper in the world is Saudi Arabia, where it's $21 per barrel. In Venezuela is about 2 cents per barrel, so to give you an idea. So the government was unwilling to take these two tough decisions because they fear about the unpopularity they will change. Well, the inaction actually, I think, was worse, because that's the popularity rating of Maduro. The inflation and the recession have been even worse. In terms of the oil sector, I think it's very interesting that it has been a little bit different, because the government is so dependent on oil that they had to become pragmatic. And as a result, they started two years ago trying to do things in order to get the oil sector going. Because Venezuela has huge reserves, but they are extra heavy oil or fields that are declining from conventional oil. So they need a lot of investment. And production has been going down despite this fabulous endowment. And as a result, the government started changing a little bit of policy. Some symbolic changes, like Reuters had this very good piece saying that that the new president of PDVSA ordered them to go to the meetings on time, wear a suit and a tie, and not dressed in the red shirts of the party of the government. But other more substantive policies, like for example signing some deals with Chevron, by which Chevron gave a loan to the JV, the joint venture in which they are with Venezuela, with PDVSA, with the national company of Venezuela, in exchange to taking more control over the cash flow and more guarantees. And so some changes have been happening. For example, they to me, to tell you the truth, was really surprising that they were able to get investment by Eni and Repsol, companies from Spain and Italy, to build an offshore natural gas project by which Venezuela now is not going to import more natural gas from Colombia, and in fact it will start to export eventually. So there have been some things happening and some changes going on. However, with the current price environment, they are unlikely to be particularly fruitful, because PDVSA has a tremendous cash flow problem, and they are supposed to be the owners of 60% of every single project. So how are they going to invest in these projects? They have a very significant lack of human resources. Of course, all the macro crisis, the crime situation, etc., in a context of lower oil prices and with other countries with much better institutions competing now with Venezuela, like Mexico, for investment. I think all those reasons make it hard to see a significant, change in the oil sector in Venezuela. However, I have to say that there is still tremendous potential, even with the extra heavy oil that it's, costlier and has to be blended with lighter oil to be exported. Even at relatively low prices like the ones we have today, it's possible to develop that under the right conditions. So I think that eventually you will see Venezuela becoming again a more relevant player in the oil sector.
Let me do an analysis of not just the oil sector, but the political economy as a whole, and say this. It seems that Venezuela's economic problems, and I'm not an economist, and maybe you will see why now in a moment with the silly things I'm going to say. Venezuela's economy shouldn't be that difficult to fix. True, the prices of oil do not help, but there's so much inefficiency in a concentrated sector of energy that all you need is a little bit of minor tweaks in oil and a few adjustments in other things that you could actually turn things around very quickly. And I think things will change in oil in the direction that Francisco is outlining. But The problem is that I find that this government has no interest in making the one correction that the country needs, and it's away from oil, and that is the way that it treats the private sector. This is a government that self-describes as socialist. They are really communists. They are interested in destroying the private sector. I have become absolutely convinced of this. They have no desire in seeing private corporations generate enough profits. There is in Venezuela a new version of a price control law that not only controls the prices that the retail economy can charge for products, but also controls how much you can make in profits. They are absolutely terrified of concentrated wealth on the private sector. And so I worry about the fact that you might have a country that will save itself through oil, and that continues oil and a devaluation, but will remain committed to ensuring that this remains the most inhospitable nation in the Americas, if not the world, for the private sector. And this is something we haven't seen in the Americas. It's no coincidence that we have scarcity as well as inflation. We have scarcity because of these price controls, and this is what you get in heavily socialist economies. This disappeared in the Americas, and we never thought we would see it go. All economists tell them you have to undo the price controls, and what they do is they double the price controls. And so the pragmatism that we might see in the oil sector, I don't think will translate into the microeconomy, the treatment of the private sector. And this is going to be what I think will continue regardless of what happens in the election.
Juan, you have some examples in microeconomy?
Sure. I mean, I just want to add to, I agree with both of what they're saying. I think that the way to view this is that this is not a government that cares about the well-being of the economy, but it cares about preserving power. And the solutions are obvious. For instance, Venezuela has had an electricity generation crisis for the last 5-6 years. There's blackouts constantly. It happened right after the government nationalized the electricity sector, took over all the electricity generation and made it state-owned. The solution is obvious. You got to fix the price system. You got to fix the pricing, the incentives for there to be investment and for their consumers to pay for their electricity and whatnot. But they haven't done it. And the reason they haven't done it is because politically it's not feasible. Because A, it might touch some special interests that they might have, or B, changing the way that Hugo Chavez used to do things undermines Nicolás Maduro's credibility with his own coalition. So you can't just come in and start doing some sort of different policy than what Chavez was doing. Regardless, what we're going to see is continued paralysis, I think, because politically, even more in the context of coming out of a legislative election in which they're going to lose probably, he's going to have much less political capital to implement any type of policy that's different from what they've already been doing. And the economy is going to suffer, but he still controls the military, he still controls the courts, and he still controls the oil wealth. So, you know, he can swing by and wait for the oil price to go up again and see what happens.
Yeah. All right. So our next topic, we will discuss around question on foreign policy and the international environment of Venezuela. If you saw the news a couple of weeks ago, there was a change in Argentina with Macri winning the presidential election in Argentina. Is the first not Peronist president in decades in Argentina, and it's turning the region, maybe going from populist government to maybe more open market governments in the region. We have to have in mind that Venezuela was led left-wing governments in South America, and populist governments, socialist governments in South America, and with the decrease of oil prices, these influences have diminished. So we have that in one hand, and on the other hand, we have serious denunciation against the and concerns relating with the foreign policy of Venezuela, but not only for former foreign policy, but the relation of Venezuela with non-traditional actors, with connections, alleged connections of the Venezuelan government with narco traffic and or with terrorist groups, which are now in all the news outside the country, outside Venezuela. But all these news are silenced, are victims of censorship in Venezuela. So I will appreciate the comments of the panelists on this topic, international and foreign policy topics.
Sure. I think, as you point out, the Argentinian presidential election has been a very significant election for the region and for Argentina. As you pointed out, the first in 100 years, either Peronist or non-Peronist or no radical that has won the elections. It's arguably the first center-right candidate that has won the elections in Argentina in a century. So it's a really relevant for Argentina itself, but also for the region, because this is the first of the regimes that were these populist left-wing regimes that were have become very powerful in the region, which were started by Chavez, but also include Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua. And this is the first one in which there is a change. So I think it's a relevant issue. I don't think that the election itself in Argentina, in terms of the election in Venezuela, has a particular impact. Voters are not looking at what happens in Argentina. However, I do think it's important because Macri, the winning candidate in Argentina, has made an issue of democracy and particularly in Venezuela, and has asked for Leopoldo López to be freed. So I think this is important. It's not only that an ally, a strong ally of the Chavismo has turned, but it has not gone to a neutral position like, say, Peña Nieto, but it has gone to someone that has really been speaking about the issues. But the other thing I think it reflects is a major change that is happening in Latin America, which is the following. We had the best decade in at least in South American countries that we had in many decades because of the significant windfall of commodities. Almost every single country in South America had a very significant increase in revenues because of the exports, particularly to Asia and to China. And that has come to maybe not an end, but at least a significant decline. So we had presidents all over the region that were extremely popular, everywhere. Not only on the left, also on the right, like, for example, the president of Colombia. However, with the exception, by the way, of Peru, which has been a strange case. However, that is turning against. And so you have now President Rousseff in Brazil with very low levels of support. You have this change in Argentina, and I think that points toward this model that was based to a significant extent on distributing this rent from natural resources. It's getting into trouble. With, I would say, I think one interesting exception, which is Bolivia, that President Morales is still extremely popular.
There's no question that U.S.-Latin America relations have changed significantly in the Americas. Let me just be emphatic about it. Perhaps I'm going to stress the point a little too much. We're living in a world where we're constantly being told that the world is full of anti-Americanism everywhere. In Latin America, the story from the last 6 years is a growth in pro-Americanism. The model that Chavez represented, that Venezuela represents, of fighting imperialism, was very popular in Latin America up until 2005. There was perhaps a break in the 90s, but in 2005, 10 years ago, the trend was this leftist, anti-imperialist tendency. It seemed hopeless. It seemed like Latin America was again leading in terms of governments whose foreign policy were very contrarian to the United States. If you look at the region now, and you don't think of Venezuela, you exclude Venezuela, most countries in the region now want deeper relations with the United States rather than thinner, more rather than fewer contacts. There are many areas of dispute: trade, drugs, human rights. But what we're now seeing is an alignment with the United States that we haven't seen in a long, long time. The exception being Venezuela. But even Cuba, I know that some of you have visited Cuba. Cuba is also interested, and you see it everywhere. And maybe it's cyclical, maybe it's, we're going to see a swing, but it's really a remarkable environment. And this, I think, is affecting what's happening in Venezuela. Venezuela is very isolated with its foreign policy of challenging the United States. It has been, in many ways, a failed foreign policy because today there are fewer Latin American countries interested in following the foreign policy model of Venezuela. It is a remarkable period. I don't know how it's going to last. I have seen the region go up and down in terms of anti-Americanism, but for the past 6 years, what we see is more interest in the part of Latin American governments to have deeper relations with the Americans.
I think in terms of international relations and the Venezuelan election in particular, we're seeing a little bit more activism on the part of Venezuela's neighbors and on the multilateral organizations like the Organization of American States to question the institutions of Venezuela and to what extent Venezuela has clean elections or a good human rights record or whatnot. I think it's easy to get carried away with the little gestures that we see, such as so-and-so saying something to the press or so-and-so writing a letter. It's easy to get carried away with that. I think what matters ultimately is that the rest of the governments in South America, majority of them are ideologically aligned to some extent with the Venezuelan government. They're also very unpopular, so they understand Maduro's predicament. And a lot of them have lost power through Congress, so they understand that too. And so they're going to say, well, okay, you lost Congress. That means that you're somewhat of a Democrat. Just try and behave a little more and we'll shut up and we won't say anything. Just to give you an example, the new president of Argentina said that he was going to try and throw Venezuela out of Mercosur, which is the regional trade bloc that involves Brazil, Argentina, and a few other countries, and Venezuela. And the president of Brazil has already said that that's off the table. Yeah. She's not going to go with that. So it's not, I don't think much will change. The tone might change, and you're going to see a few gestures towards the opposition. Now that the opposition is going to show electorally that they are the majority, I think it'll give them a legitimacy in the eyes of the international community that they had lacked up until now. We'll see how that translates into foreign policy directly with respect to Venezuela. But it's going to be gradual. I think it's going to be gradual.
Okay, I think with this, these were the four main topics we wanted to discuss. This was the end of our initial script. So, but what we're gonna do now is to play a little jazz and improvisation, and we will go through your questions. So, I will read some questions from the audience. Okay, one question from Javier is, do you see any change in the strategy of the opposition running this election compared to other previous campaigns?
Sure. I would say that one of the favorite games of many of my colleagues, political scientists, is to criticize the Venezuelan opposition. The argument is the reason that they have never defeated Chavismo has got to be because they make mistakes. This is an easy argument to make, to blame all mistakes or explain all mistakes by saying all these electoral losses by saying they played mistakes. And I have always argued that actually the Venezuelan opposition has done incredibly well considering the obstacles against it. The Venezuelan opposition has been able to maintain unity when most of the time in most countries opposition parties tend to split because there's so many disagreements about strategy. Do you talk or not talk to the government? They have been able to maintain unity. They have been able to fight abstentionism, which is the tendency of people who feel defeated, who feel like there's no hope, that the electoral system is so rigged against you. They have been able to fight that. And they have been able to coordinate electoral strategies. They have been able to make sure that they do not have surplus candidates, that if there's one seat for office, that they will present only one candidate. So that required a lot of negotiation among incredibly disparate groups. This is huge. Very few opposition parties do this. And I think we're seeing the results of this. Why is it that they have never had major victories? That's because they were fighting a petrostate that was very popular in a consumption boom that Francisco and Juan were describing. But they have recovered from the dead in a way that is almost unheard of. in Latin America and in many countries. It's, I would say, a remarkable story. Now, they have made many mistakes, and we can talk about them. They don't have. Sometimes they don't have. One could argue a strategic vision of how they need to differentiate themselves from the government. Sometimes they sound too much like the government. But in general, in terms of unity, abstention, and producing the right number of candidates based on seats to be elected, they've done really well. And so kudos to the opposition.
Okay, thank you, Javier. Next question is for Juan. President Maduro has threatened in some speeches that if the government loses this election, people will go out to the street to support the government. Do you see people going to march and going to the street to support the government on December the 7th?
Not in large masses. I mean, we have to take into account next year there's no elections in Venezuela, and traditionally when there's no elections in Venezuela, there's a lot of protests. So particularly in a scenario where you're going to have divided government, that's a recipe for disaster, I think. But I think December 7th is going to be shocking to many people. You know, me, myself included, probably all we're saying is going to happen might not happen, so we might be shocked. But I think that the government is going to have to do some soul searching about what has gone wrong and how their strategy didn't pan out, which I think is what is going to happen. Whether there's a potential for violence, yes. Again, Chavismo negotiates in bravado. It lives off it. It has to show a strong face. It has to say, it doesn't matter if we lose the election, we're going to go out in the streets and we're going to govern anyway. And that's their modus operandi. Whether that's going to be a feasible way of running the country is open to question. I think that we have to keep in mind that and this goes back to somewhat of the narrative of the campaign. One of the bases of the people's allegiance to the Bolivarian Revolution is that for many, they felt that the government of Hugo Chavez and the way that the Bolivarian Revolution was managed gave them dignity, gave them a place in society that society had maybe excluded them from. There's nothing that says you have no dignity more than forcing you to stand in line for 8 hours to buy toilet paper. So all that goodwill that they had engendered with their voters has been lost somewhat. And we're seeing that in the polls, and we're probably going to see that Sunday. How you recover from that, and how you make those people that you've insulted by forcing them to sit under the hot tropical sun to buy a piece of chicken, how you tell them then, oh, we lost the election, now you have to go march for me. I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Okay, thank you, Juan. The next question is for Francisco. I think it has two questions in one. One is international. It's related to could Venezuela manage next year the disagreements inside the OPEC concerning the price of oil? Is there any impact that the country and the OPEC can do today in the 21st century on the price of oil? And the other question, which is a real concern not only for Venezuela but for people doing business in Venezuela. What is your vision for the foreign exchange control for next year? It's a little science fiction, the second question, but let's see.
Yeah, well, in terms of OPEC, Venezuela is in a very weak position and has been shown in the last year or so inside OPEC, because a country that cannot increase production and that has an amazing endowment, but in which production is declining and there is little investment happening, and a country that had a fiscal break-even, that was, as I mentioned, it was, Venezuela was spending like oil was at $170 when it was at 100, right? So to give you an idea, the only other OPEC country that is declining, in which in this year the GDP is declining, is Libya, that is in the middle of a civil war. So all the other OPEC countries are having, like Ecuador has almost zero, small negative decline, but all the others have positive. Even Nigeria, which is not particularly well managed macroeconomy, is doing significantly much better than Venezuela. So Venezuela is it's a country that does not have any room to negotiate. So whatever happens in OPEC, it's what the Saudis, decide that is going to happen in OPEC. And of course, as you know, there is a lot of speculation about what Saudi Arabia will do or not do. And we have a change in the elite, in the king of Saudi Arabia, and some movements inside the government that might lead to some eventual change in policy. It's also very interesting what is happening in the neighbors, Iraq and Iran. But I think Venezuela, it's a non-entity almost in OPEC. I mean, they have tried hard to bring Russia and OPEC together, but that's a hard unity to play. In terms of the exchange rate control, I think it's very unlikely that nothing significant will happen there. I think there will be some devaluation at some point, but the problem is that if Maduro, as we seem to be expecting, maybe less optimistically Javier than Juan and I, is going to lose the election by a significant margin, the government is going to be weaker. So a president who has been unable to take any decision, for 2 years, is going to start taking the tough decisions under this situation. It's sort of hard to believe. I mean, there could be, very different scenarios. Your colleagues in Caracas Chronicles are suggesting that we could have a Ceausescu scenario in which the government collapses. Some other people have suggested, like Francisco Rodriguez from Bank of America, that there could be a negotiated transition in Venezuela, in which even there could be a president that it's an interim president that it's in agreement between two sides and things like that. So there are a variety of scenarios in which you could imagine that there might be some economic change, but the one that I see the most plausible, which is one in which Maduro basically doesn't change that much, is one in which macroeconomic policy will continue to be very, very, very bad quality.
Okay, I think this is a merge of two questions. I think it applies for all of you. Because there's one thing also in Venezuelan elections. Sometimes the Chavismo losing, they win. There's a story of the Caracas mayor, Antonio Ledesma, that he won his election, he was elected the mayor, but then the government found the change in the budgets and the laws to reduce the power of the mayor, that at the end he ended not having any power to govern, and now he's in jail. I mean, he's in his house, but he's being prosecuted. So the audience is curious about what is the roadmap for an opposition in this scenario of winning a majority in the parliament. What do you think is the roadmap for the first semester, for August, for December? Is there any program of the opposition to try to balance the power of the state or any action of the state before the new National Assembly start having functions next year?
Sure.
Yeah, I think.
Well, I mean, the levers of power are still controlled by the government, with in this case, the exception of the National Assembly. I mean, I think one big change, we will have a new president of the National Assembly that is not Diosdado Cabello, which is now the second most powerful man, or arguably the first in Venezuela. And so we'll have some visible figure from the opposition to negotiate, and it's still a question mark of who that person is gonna be. But I do think that, as we all have been commenting, I mean, we have had previous episodes. You mentioned the one of Alcalde Ledesma, but also, the referendum on the new constitution. They lost the election, but they then pursued every single of the reforms without, without winning the referendum. That is sort of the default, I think, strategy, right? To minimize the power of the National Assembly, to rule by decree, to approve an enabling law just before they leave. By the way, Cristina Kirchner is, approved 90 laws like in one night the other day to leave Macri in Argentina with everything, set up. They will definitely try to do that. We know that they are trying to pack the court with really, really, really loyal Chavistas to make it really hard for any change to happen there. And so, in the end, the Constitutional Court in Venezuela has tremendous power to say that, oh no, what the Congress did is not constitutional and the like. So, but I think in the end, the big game is a political game. It depends on actually, what inside the Venezuelans, the electorate and the international pressures force them or not to do, and how these figures, like the members of the Constitutional Tribunal, see things progressing. Because if they feel, the court in Venezuela was totally packed by people from the previous regime, and they, because Chavez was, popular, 60% popularity, they allowed him to get full control over Congress, for example. So I do think that there might be changes if the political events lead to that. But for sure, that will be, I think, the default strategy to sideline the.
Javier?
If I were the opposition, what I would do, leave the economy to the government. Let them deal with the mess. Sure. Don't go there. And focus on one change in Venezuela. Reform the constitution to eliminate indefinite re-election. Venezuela has the distinction of being one of the few countries where there are no term limits. If they could change that, this would be a major transformation, because the moment that you have a term limit, you will affect the dynamics in the ruling party. The ruling party will say, Maduro is gone, we can now emerge as new forces out there in the market to compete, possible bridges between some wings of Chavismo with the opposition. I think it's going to be a difficult thing to do. The president is, of course, going to hate it, but I don't think other members of the ruling party will object to this. And it'll be nice. It'll be just one focus with enormous political repercussions, and leave the economy to the government, the ones who know the least about it.
One of the remarkable things that we're seeing in opinion polls right now in Venezuela is that upwards of 65% of people want Maduro's term to end now. Like, they want him out, whether by a referendum or to resign or something like that. I mean, it's one thing to have an unpopular president. It's quite another one to want him to leave right this minute. People in Venezuela instinctively understand that Maduro has no capacity to deal with the economy, that things are not going to get better anytime soon if he's still in power. This presents a conundrum for the opposition, because the opposition has two camps. There's one camp that's more radical, it's more associated with Leopoldo López, who's in prison, who's one of the leaders of the opposition, who really want to put an end to the government via the constitutional ways that there are, via resignation or a referendum or a constitutional assembly or whatnot. There's another segment of the opposition that wants to ease the transition, to negotiate, to maybe try and modify the institutions to see if we can find a way to coexist. The continuous roadblocks that the government is going to throw an opposition-controlled National Assembly is going to embolden the more radical segment of the opposition, who, by the way, feels emboldened by 65% of the people who want Maduro to leave. So I think that what we're going to see is an increase in radicalism. Sadly, for those of us who believe in trying to find some way of dialoguing, and I think that that's probably going to be one key source of conflict in the coming months.
Okay, I think these are the last two questions. We have one from YouTube. We're broadcasting live on YouTube, so one of the members of the audience in YouTube sent this question. People is asking whether a victory of the opposition can encourage economic liberals and pro-business groups to support the opposition, or to see closely the Venezuelan situation, maybe get more involved in a change for the future elections in the country. If they see the opposition as a solution for an opening for private investment. And then other questions from the audience are asking about the relevance of the election from the point of view of the United States and the point of view of China, which is also a major actor in the Venezuelan economy and society now. So I think we start first with the reaction or the encouragement of economic liberal and pro-business groups with the result of the election if it's in favor of the opposition. And then we go to the relevance of the election for China and the United States.
I mean, I think, I'm not sure that I understand totally the question, but I think that of course, the private sector in Venezuela, at least the one that is not, benefiting from the controls, the crazy controls in which you can, in Venezuela you can get $1 for 630 bolivars at the official exchange rate, and the other one is like 700 or 800. So imagine the profit that you can make if you are connected to the government. So there are some private sector crony capitalists who are tremendously benefiting, right? On the other hand, as Javier said, this is a government that has been an enemy of the private sector and private enterprise, particularly the one that is Venezuelan, because they see them as political rivals. And the private sector has, for sure, mostly supported the opposition candidates, but they have been first of all, they are in a very weak position now because the economy is doing so badly, and they have been attacked so many times, and also because if you are seen as a supporter of the opposition, the government basically punishes you. So the private sector in Venezuela has been in a very difficult sort of position, and I don't know if this next year they will have a big role to play. I do agree completely with Javier that the opposition shouldn't take the lead in terms of economic issues. They should fall. The political cost of the economy has to fall in the hands of the government. However, the private sector will try to push the assembly to do something because they are desperate. So that might be a point of contention.
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
China. Can I talk a little bit about China and the United States? China is facing a conundrum with Venezuela. On the one hand, it is one of the countries in Latin America, if not among the world nations, that Venezuela has provided such sweet economic deals to the Chinese. And at the same time, it is one of the worst performing partners. So it has a very close relationship because it gets so much out of the government, but it's so difficult to work with Maduro and Venezuelans in general.
Not us.
Yes. In many ways, it could be said that Venezuela is the first example of the China approach to development failing big time. The idea that you will offer a lot of support in return for very little conditionalities on governance. What we're seeing is that this model of Chinese interaction with developing countries is collapsing, and the Venezuelan case is an example of that. It's the first case, and I think the Chinese are aware of that. Does that mean that the Chinese are ready to support the opposition? And here is the paradox. Absolutely not. The Chinese will continue to want to benefit the country, even though it is fully aware that it is one of its most dysfunctional partners. And this is not that unheard of. It happens all the time. It's sunk investments. They have so much at stake that they just don't want the investment to go away. They will want to protect it, even when it already feels like it's a lot of bad money going into it. So from the point of view of China, it's going to be very difficult for China to be in love with the idea of regime change in the direction of the opposition. That's all I want to say about China.
Well, I'll just add to that, and I hate to end this on a negative note, but one of the mistakes that we've talked about, the mistakes of the opposition, one of the mistakes of the opposition is their very basic understanding of foreign policy. The opposition in Venezuela does not have a clear idea of China, of what role China is going to play in the transition, of the pros and cons of the Chinese involvement in Venezuela, and that's a real shame. For instance, I've never heard of a leader of the opposition ever going to China, or actually saying something smart about the relationship between Venezuela and China. With the US, it's understandable because it's such a touchy subject. I mean, I'm sure they have ideas, but they don't talk about it in public. But with China, you have a country that's very heavily involved in the country, that has considerable clout, and also has imposed conditions that some would even call anti-national, if you will, And the opposition doesn't have a clear idea of how to deal with it. So, to add to what you're saying, I think that part of the reason why China doesn't want or maybe necessarily think that regime change would be a good thing is because they don't really know these guys. And they don't know what to expect from them. And they don't have any trust in them. And that's been their failing. That's been the opposition's failing to not establish a connection or a bridge to China, if you will. So,
thank you. So I think this gig has come to an end. And thank you.